So everyone's been looking at this picture for a minute, right? Can you think back and remember your first reaction to it? Did you assume that each of these people were engineers or designers, beginners or experienced, straight or queer, employees or founders, disabled or not, overqualified or underqualified, immigrants or citizens, short-tempered or patient? Of course, as soon as you consciously start thinking about it, you know you can't tell any of these things for sure just by looking at a picture. But even so, it's completely normal for your brain to start to unconsciously tell these sorts of stories by piecing together patterns and stereotypes that you've seen or heard in the past. My brain does it too. If those stereotypes that you've absorbed from the media or friends and family, if they're negative stereotypes, then the biases that guide your decisions and actions will be negative too. And most people don't want to be racist or sexist, but a lot of us are unconsciously biased against certain groups anyway, even in ways that we consciously recognize as unfair. When stereotypes lead to unconscious bias about who can thrive in science and tech, this leads to barriers to entering STEM fields, the so-called pipeline problem. So in this study, researchers found that there are systematic differences between job description wordings in male-dominated and female-dominated fields. Plus, the researchers found that women are less likely to think they belong in job roles if they're advertised in more masculine wording. So even if they have the skills to do the job well, they're going to find the job less appealing just based on the description. And once someone applies for a job, study after study has found evidence of bias against almost any marginalized group that you can think of in terms of who gets called back for an interview. So Stephanie mentioned an example yesterday about Black people applying for jobs, but also gay men, people with disabilities, mothers, people with Arabic names, and many, many other groups. Anyone who's just a little bit outside the stereotype for a job can find it harder to get that on-site interview and demonstrate how good they actually are. And the pipeline is only the beginning of the harmful effects of stereotypes. Once marginalized people get their foot in the door, unconscious bias also leads to barriers to rising in tech. And these barriers can be especially high for people at the intersection of multiple kinds of underrepresented demographics. So for instance, women and racial minorities are both less likely to be given the benefit of the doubt. And the problem is only worse if you're both a woman and a racial or ethnic minority. But when women of color are assertive, when they demonstrate leadership and competence, the data shows they get extra pushback for it. And even when you are successful, these harassing or unsupportive work environments can be a common reason for leaving tech. And women do leave science and tech at greater rates than they leave the non-STEM workforce. So the top orange line here shows women being retained in non-STEM fields, so outside of tech, and the blue line dropping off below it is women being retained in STEM fields. And only 20% of the women who leave are taking a break, for instance, for family reasons. The other 80% still have jobs, they're just working in other fields. One reason is financial. So there is a pay gap in tech between men and women, between white people and racial or ethnic minorities, and between moms and everyone else. And the pay gap depends on job role too. So this study from Hired found that there's a larger pay gap in software engineering and data science, which the blue bars here show have fewer women, and a smaller pay gap in fields like design that have more women. So if someone thinks they can make a fairer salary in a different role that they also enjoy and are good at, why not switch? But hardly anyone makes career decisions based solely on compensation. There are many, many cultural cues that a company can give to signal that an employee is not valued that encourage them to leave. So one kind of these signals is feedback and performance reviews. So in this study of tech workers, the majority of women received negative feedback, while the majority of men received only positive constructive feedback. And the negative feedback for women was often about personality traits in ways that reflect common unconscious biases, like telling women to pipe down or be less abrasive. Together, these stereotypes keep some underrepresented groups still underrepresented in tech and reinforce the pre-existing stereotypes, creating what we've dubbed the positive feedback loop of negative stereotypes. So this summarized several decades worth of research. I give you this iconic paper titled, "The Existence of Implicit Bias is Beyond Reasonable Doubt." And as I started reading all this, I was surprised to learn that the so-called debate about climate change, among social scientists, the role of bias in holding back white women, people of color, queer folks, disabled folks, and more, is just a non-issue. Unconscious bias is real, and it is impacting diversity. Maybe the majority of you already knew that unconscious bias was a problem. And if so, there's data to show that you're not alone in recognizing that issue. So this data from Stack Overflow shows that the majority of white male software engineers worldwide, 60%, they think that diversity is important. And that number is a really good start, even though that fraction is much lower than the fraction of people in any other demographic. So that's the bad news. But we're only, 6 minutes into the talk so far? There's plenty of time to talk about the optimistic side and solutions too. So even though stereotypes come from our environment, that does not make us powerless. We still have the power to address those stereotypes head on, to reduce our unconscious bias, to think with empathy and act with compassion, and to work together to create social structures that encourage everyone to be supportive of everyone else. And the Unconscious Bias Project was founded to help you do just that. So UBP is a group of science and tech folks who care about reducing unconscious bias in our communities and give talks for our peers like this one. And we all have other day jobs too. So I'm a data scientist at Stitch Fix, which is a tech and retail company in San Francisco that offers a personalized styling service to men and women. And the Unconscious Bias Project hosted or spoke at 19 different events in 2017, and I'm really excited to kick off our 2018 with this talk today. And I've been friends with UBP's founder since we were in college together at the University of Washington, so shout out to all the Seattle folks. So UBP is super practical and action-oriented, so I'll spend the rest of our time talking about 2 different ways that you can take action against unconscious bias. Words that you can say when you find yourself in a bias situation, and ways you can hack your thoughts to reduce your own unconscious bias. For the words section, we've worked with a cartoonist named Teresa Oborn in Portland to illustrate a whole bunch of situations that come up in science and tech workplaces. Every one of the cartoons on the next few slides came from a real experience that someone told us about. There's loads more cartoons on the UBP website too, unconsciousbiasproject.org. So here's one of Teresa's cartoons. Who's heard this one before? She's really smart, but I wish she wasn't so bossy. Yeah, when I give this talk to rooms with more women in them, there's a lot more hands raised, FYI. So what are your options when someone says this to you? One option is to say nothing. It's okay to pick your battles. Another option is to observe that the comment is stereotypical and hurtful, just saying something simple like, ouch, that's a bit harsh. Another option is to redirect by countering the stereotype and say something like, she's not bossy, she's a leader. A positive comment like this can help weaken the negative stereotype for those around you without being too confrontational or derailing the conversation if you're not in the mood for it. Instead of a microaggression, we call this a microaffection. And if unconscious bias is a common occurrence in your environment, you can consider using the buddy system. And that can make sticking up for your coworkers in bias situations much more powerful. So to use the buddy system, simply find a buddy. Maybe have a secret handshake or something. Anyway, once you have your buddy, you and your buddy can remind each other before meetings or events to be on the lookout for bias for each other. And the bias buddy can do many things. So for interruptions, I want to hear what Sarah has to say. For giving credit, Ahmed just said that 15 minutes ago. For giving emotional support, she was a real jerk to you in there. And you can also get recon after the fact. So if you witness someone saying something biased, but you're not sure what the victim actually wants in the moment, you can check in with them after the fact and find out more about what they would appreciate you saying in the future. Here's a bias buddy example that happened on the Django IRC. So I've changed the names and edited it a little bit. So Antonio says, hey guys, I really need another project in my CV. Beth responds with an observation about the stereotype. Some of us aren't guys. Carl steps in as a bias buddy to Beth and redirects Antonio to the Django code of conduct. He then gives a fantastic explanation of one reason why bias buddies can be so powerful, because it shares the load and takes the burden off of the people being stereotyped. Antonio responds with more bias, kind of saying that he should get to be the judge of what Beth and other people should feel. And Carl responds by being a bias buddy again and clearly labeling Antonio's bias. Nobody is entitled to decide what's a justified reason for other people to feel bad. What about this situation? I think you'd advance further if your hair were more professional. Even though the speaker here means well, her advice assumes that it's okay to make women, especially women of color, spend time, money, and energy in conforming their appearance to their environment. But in an inclusive environment, Latifah wouldn't have to do that extra work. And she doesn't need to do the work of explaining why not either. She could reflect the comment back and say, what's unprofessional about my natural hair? This strategy of making the speaker do the work of challenging their own assumptions is one of my favorites. Here's a cartoon about bias against working mothers, which is still a huge problem. Preeti, you work so hard and your code is always top-notch, but I wonder what will happen when you want to start a family. When Preeti is questioned about her dedication to her career, she might want to respond by transferring the work back and saying, why do you think good work and good parenting are mutually exclusive? Or what if this is the 5th time today that Preeti has been asked this question and she's just sick of responding to bias with tact? Instead, she can give herself permission to be snarky and blunt and say something like, I have a right to maternity leave whether you like it or not. Microaggressions like this can add up, and it's okay to feel stressed when they accumulate. And if you see someone else do something that seems like overreacting, remember that what might look like a minor isolated incident to you could be a larger pattern of harmful bias to them. And even though expressing anger can be healthy, it's also healthy to have strategies to stay calm if you want to. So there's these 4 pillars of self-awareness from psychology. First, you can check in with yourself emotionally. So ask yourself how you're feeling. If this sort of interaction makes you so anxious that you can't focus for the rest of the day, just acknowledge that's normal and okay. Second, you can check in with your body. Breathe. Relax your face muscles. Check your body language. At the cognitive level, remind yourself why you're doing this in the first place. I like to remember that everyone is capable of change and use that as inspiration to keep going with the conversation. But maybe you have a different value like hope or courage or something that you can repeat in your head to keep yourself focused if you get frustrated. And last, behavioral. You can always step away or ask to revisit something later. Maybe taking a walk with your coworker could help. Moms aren't the only parents who get hurt by bias. A lot of the dads report frustration too, and others assume that they're not taking an active role in parenting. So here, when one man asks, does your wife take care of the kids or do you do daycare? The other man could respond by saying that he stays home with the kids. Going even further, the dad might decide it's a good time to redirect and remind the man that not all families have one mom and one dad. This example is a little bit more subtle. So here, a VP is asking a Black senior engineer if he can represent the department at an orientation event for freshman interns. And people of color are often asked to show up at events like this to give the appearance of diversity. But if the team isn't actually diverse and this unpaid work falls disproportionately on just a few people, it can add up and make it harder for them to meet other career goals. By saying, not this time, I need to stay on track for the next product release, the engineer can redirect back to shared priorities and give a reminder of the value of his paid work. Or he could label the bias and call it out, saying something like, it'd be great if the team had more minorities to share that responsibility with me. That might help his boss see the connection between unconscious bias in the moment and the more systemic diversity problem at the company. So next time you hear a biased comment, whether it's directed at you or your bias buddy, remember that you have options for how to handle the situation. Everything from observing the problem to transferring the work to labeling the stereotype. And sometimes the only way to get heard is to get angry. So switching gears to thoughts now. So who in the audience has gone through some sort of diversity training that they thought was a big waste of time? Yep, more hands there. As it turns out, the bad training can not only not reduce bias, but it can actually leave attendees with more hostile attitudes towards people that don't look like them. A bad training can make people more aware of our differences without giving tools to help reconcile those differences in your brain. So I think a lot of the backlash towards these diversity trainings is pretty warranted. So at UVP, we try really hard to only focus on evidence-based approaches. So one of those is this fantastic paper that we found. So in a controlled lab setting, these researchers found that their training worked to reduce unconscious bias for at least 3 months, which is pretty awesome. And one of the reasons the training seems to be so effective is that attendees leave with an increased concern about unconscious bias, as well as strategies that they can practice over time to help reduce that bias. So what are those mental exercises, you might ask? I will tell you. The first strategy is stereotype replacement. So the idea here is to consciously recognize that the thought you had just stemmed from a stereotype instead of leaving that bias like buried in the back of your brain. So do you remember your reactions to this picture from the beginning of the talk? Once you've acknowledged what's going on in your brain, you can choose to replace any biased aspects of your gut reaction with different, less stereotypical thoughts. So for instance, if you thought maybe they're junior engineers, you could catch yourself and think, or maybe not. Maybe they're senior engineers, or managers, or CEOs. Another strategy is counter-stereotypic examples. So when you're presented with a stereotype, you can picture a counterexample, like a friend or a family member, or coworker, or famous person, or even a fictional character. One paper found that conjuring an image of Obama after exposure to an anti-Black stereotype was enough to actually reduce how much someone acts with bias, which is pretty cool. The next strategy is individuating. So instead of lumping a person in with all the other members of their group, try to get to know them as a unique person. And even if you're just passing them, you can try to know their particular style, or like glasses, clothes, facial features, anything. Perspective taking is another one. So if you find yourself thinking stereotypic thoughts about someone, imagine how hurt you'd feel if someone made assumptions about you based off your name or some physical trait that you had no control over. And the last one can be pretty fun, increasing opportunities for contact. So all these approaches play off each other too. As you get to know more people from a given group that you might be biased against, you can start using them as counter-stereotypic examples and so on. I'm not gonna lie though, increasing opportunities for contact can be scary sometimes too. For some people, nervousness about getting it right can actually get in the way of being our best and most human selves. Or maybe you really care about sharing your privilege and helping another group, but you don't know where to start. If you struggle with this, it might help to shift things in your head and choose a different goal, maybe something like understanding instead of helping. And when in doubt, it's always a good move to listen and be genuinely curious. Twitter and blogs can be an awesome way to get started with this because you can follow along and listen and get a sense of what someone is interested in talking about. And yeah, it also helps to be open to hearing things you didn't expect, to reading body language cues, and believing what people say about their experiences, even if it seems different from what you thought you knew about the situation. And if someone gives you some hard feedback or simply doesn't have time for you, just try to stay humble. Other people are the main characters of their own stories. So unconsciously biased thoughts are a habit. And like any habit, it can be broken. It takes conscious effort though. It takes time and motivation and willingness to do things differently. So biased thoughts are a habit that can mostly be broken though. So unless you live under a rock, we're all being exposed to stereotypes constantly. You can never quite be cured of unconscious bias. But over time, the strategies to reduce bias become habits themselves, and it'll feel easier to squash unconscious bias when it comes up again. And with that, let's wrap it up. So yes, unconscious bias is a real problem. And yes, ways to reduce unconscious bias are real too. No matter what roles we each play in different situations, we all have options for what to say in the moment when we see or experience unconscious bias. And even though most of us have unconscious bias, those biases don't own us. With dedication, we can practice breaking the bias habit and becoming closer to the people around us, and becoming closer to the people we want to be. So I'd like to thank the organizers who've done such a great job with putting together a conference that, as far as I've seen, has been really inclusive. So round of applause for you guys. I'd also like to thank all of the other incredible folks who help volunteer and organize the Unconscious Bias Project. We have a ton of materials on our website and lots of ways for you to get involved if you want to check it out. And finally, I'd like to thank Stitch Fix for sending me here. It's a wonderful place to work with wonderful people who actually care about all this stuff. So it's a real treat to be there. Thanks.